Here we are. So we are in a studio of Nancy Landis in Elizabethtown.
In
Elizabethtown.
The very edges of Elizabethtown.
Yeah, but there's no town around. It's a property, a wonderful property, surrounded by meadows, and I hear chickens and sheep.
Yes.
So why?
My husband and I were looking for a couple acres about 33 years ago. I had a horse, and we had just gotten married, and I thought it would be nice to have an acre or two to have a horse here. And when we looked around the land for sale for 15 acres, which is what we ended up with, was about the same price as it was for 2 acres. So we thought, okay, why not? And then that's blossomed into all sorts of animals, and
it looks great.
Fun. It's been very fun.
You don't have many neighbors.
We have very nice neighbors, but they're all about a quarter mile away.
Okay, I'm here because I would like to talk about your fraktur art. I found that on the internet, on your website for the first time. So that started my interest, and I would like to know how you got started with that.
I originally met fraktur when I was a child. I grew up in this area, and frakturs have always been something I've known what they are. I just never really looked at them twice. When I was in 5th or 6th grade, it was 1976, which is the bicentennial of the United States, and frakturs, for whatever reason, for that bicentennial celebration, became kind of a very kitschy, tacky kind of art that everybody was promoting, and it was just, I just had a bad feeling about it from that. I really didn't care for fraktur at all, I can honestly say. From 2001 to 2006, I worked as the education coordinator at Landis Valley Museum, which is our local history site. And I was I would develop programs for visiting school kids, for scouts, or sometimes even families to work on. And one of the programs we wanted to develop was one on Pennsylvania German fraktur. So I had visited the galleries at Landis Valley, and when I saw the original frakturs, the 1700s frakturs, the 1850s frakturs, I fell in love with them. There was something so genuine and so earnest about them. It just came across the years, and it just swept me away. I took a class that I could better understand them, led by Jerry Dickerman, who was a local, now late, fraktur artist in our area. He was really a nice instructor, and it was just a weekend class, but he really knew a lot, and it meant a lot to me to suddenly fall in love with this. I'd been a watercolor artist, so it was just a step down the road a little bit to get into fraktur. But he broke the frakturs down into elements for me, so that really helped me understand them. And I have one here. A fraktur generally is a certificate. It can commemorate milestones in your life, and they're often wedding certificates or baptismal certificates or birth certificates. They kind of arose from that time when actually there weren't any courthouses in the colonies, and to record these things was a challenge. There was no printing presses, there were no officials to do this sort of a event, so creating their own certificates was just something that the Germans brought with them from their home. So looking at it as a certificate, you'll see that there's 3 elements, and this is what I was saying. This is how you can build a fraktur. You, of course, have the calligraphy portion of the fraktur, and that's what the fraktur will say. In older times, they very often included Bible verses, or wedding vows. Some of them actually had advice and wisdom to share. So that is the calligraphy portion. The next portion is the illumination, which will be any of the folk art imagery or decoration that brings the fraktur. It's I guess a lot of it's feel, for lack of a better word. And then most frakturs will have a geometric border, so that's the 3rd element. And of course there's some geometry going on inside. I think it's a wonderful thing that the more decorated your certificate was back in the day, the more important it was. Back in the 17 to 1800s, there was a lot of illiteracy. People couldn't necessarily read things, but when they saw an illuminated certificate, they knew it was a very important piece of paper. And I think it's very ironic that today, most people in Lancaster County can't read Pennsylvania German. And so we're right back where we started, where we see a fancy certificate and all the beautiful German writing. Now, of course, this is in English, but we're right back in the same shoes where we have these beautiful certificates that really are a challenge to read, but often considered art.
So, if I go to old churches in the Palatinate, where I was baptized, for example, we see the usage of colors. A wooden church, wooden Bordkarich, as we call it, where the choir sang, where the organ is.
Right.
This part was often painted.
Oh,
in a way, you do it with the frames, with the framing, and they use the same colors: red, yellow, and green.
Okay.
And I would like to know what you know about the usage of colors.
I do tend to stick to a very limited palette. The frakturs tend to be, like you were saying, and again, I am referencing the ones that are at Landis Valley in the collection from the 17 and 1800s. But it does seem as though this red, this almost orangey red, is a very typical color. The greens can be so dark, they're almost black. So that was the one color that seems to have more of a range to it. Gold, more than yellow, I think. And that might be due to age. It's hard to tell what they looked like when they were new. And I do use like an indigo blue, and I've seen that too. I think it just had to do with the pigments that they had available to them back in that time period. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what they made them out of. That would be an interesting thing to research.
Mm-hmm. But this fraktur looks in somewhere modern to me, because you have painted here a deer, a fish.
This is a certificate for a retiring chairman from this company. Uh-huh. And it's the Pennsylvania Association of Mutual Insurance Companies. And so these are all Pennsylvania symbols: the ruffled grouse, the brook trout, okay, the white-tailed deer. Uh-huh. So these are actually not very typical fraktur inclusions, but I did it especially for this fellow. But it is an interesting example of how you can distort what you put in a fraktur and have it still look like a fraktur. Mm-hmm. I did one once. The couple had gotten married in Australia. We included a crocodile and a cockatoo, which is the bird with the big white curly feathers, and a koala bear. And I would, when they were telling me what they wanted on their fraktur, I was thinking, this is not a fraktur. But when we were done with it, it was a fraktur. When you hold all the elements together, it seems to come out.
How many do you do in a year?
I probably do close to 100. I just work off my website. I don't know how people find it, but they seem to. I'm not much of a webmaster. People will call me. They'll say, I have a grandchild who was just born, or my friend's getting married in September, and do you think you can do a fraktur for me? And we sit and talk about the things that might be important to include in the fraktur. For instance, I'm actually working on one here for a family named Farkas. Oh, I don't think I have it far enough done. But Farkas means wolf. It's a German name. So I have two wolves here. So that was really important to her, and very atypical. She wanted a desert scene because these people live in Arizona. So we have some Arizona cactus. I put some little quail, and these were very specific things that she wanted me to include. So I'm not going to deny her, and it'll come out just fine.
Do you get any requests for frakturs with Pennsylvania German inscription?
I do, and I love to do those. I had one here, actually. Where did it go? Oh, this one. There we go. has the German version of welcome on it. And you'll have to tell me what that says. Does it say, God bless all who enter here, I believe?
That's correct.
Right. So I do get
So
occasional requests, which is,
Mhm.
that's the true fraktur in my mind.
I've seen those symbols or pictures in books of the Schwenkfelders.
Right, yes, it's very similar to that, right. I try not to steal anything. Fraktur got a start in school, do you know that? And I think it was a European tradition that when you graduated from school in the 1700s, you created a certificate of merit that included your name, Bible verse, and a lot of very impressive handwriting, geometric design, the Vorschriften, I think they were called. They were put together to show off everything that you'd learned in school. Your handwriting, your penmanship. Of course, you need to know math and everything else to pull off the geometry. And kids would practice by copying frakturs that their schoolmaster had put together. So that's very strong from a European. I think that's where they sort of got a toehold here. They came over almost as a school lesson. And you're learning a lot of valuable things when you copy a fraktur. Even you're learning a Bible verse, you're learning handwriting, you're learning spelling, you're learning geometry. You're learning a lot of interesting, valuable things.
Multi-perspective learning, so to say.
Right. So they were very popular here. That was just the one, and then they went on to become, their certificates that they needed here, the marriage and the birth. They did Halssegen, which I believe are house blessings, mostly in nature. So things like that were very common here. Although people copied frakturs in schools, I try to keep myself from doing that. But I often will allow a fraktur to inspire me enough that I will style it after a certain fraktur master that I see in a book. So
there's no copyright on any fraktur.
There isn't, but yeah. On the other hand, you want to also be true to yourself too. So. But some of the older ones are just wonderful, absolutely wonderful.
I like the Schwenkfelder motifs most.
Yes.
Because I cannot say why, but there's something special.
There is something amazing, just absolutely amazing about them.
And it seems to have stopped in the 1830s when the state law was passed that from 1834 on they had, a certain kind of school learning had to be in English, I guess.
Yes,
yeah.
I think the biggest contributor to the demise was actually the printing press, because until then presses were few and far between. There was one in Philadelphia, there was one in Baltimore, there was one up at Ephrata Cloister, but it wasn't as though you could have a lot of things printed. But by 1830s and 40s and 50s, printing presses are popping up all over the place. And at that time, if you think about things the way they might have, having something printed cost a lot of money. It was a pretty cutting edge technology. It was neat to have a printing press on the block. If you had something printed, that was quality. That was the thing to have. Up until then, they were imitating the printing press even by creating the broken letter writing. Not creating it, by using it, the old German script, where the letters were broken, almost to imitate the block set of a type on a printing press. So now you have a printing press ability, and that's when the broadsides, I call them broadsides, I think that's a proper term, where they could print as many frakturs as they liked and then fill them in by hand. And those are common, you see them often in antique markets now. You hardly ever see a real fraktur, but you'll see the broadsides. And the broadsides kind of took over the market, I believe. I know there were actually even door-to-door peddlers that would go around pushing the broadsides that they had created and printed and then filling them out for families by hand, rather than letting the schoolmaster of the town create one for you special. So I think that sort of diluted it. And then by the time the 1900s came along and they were all I mean, even today, when you get married in Lancaster County, you go down to the courthouse, they give you a certificate that looks like a fractur. Oh, it's terrible. I think ours is still rolled up in a closet, but it's a print, and then somebody just took a ballpoint pen and filled in the rest by hand. So, I mean, how awful is that?
And do you teach fraktur also?
I have. I've done some classes on request. Oh my gosh, over COVID, we actually did Zoom fractur classes, which doesn't really work all that well unless someone really has a handle on art to start with. I like fractur though, because you don't have to be an artist to do fractur. It almost comes off a lot nicer if you're not a dyed-in-the-wool artist. So, but I've left Landis Valley under very friendly terms, and I've been back many times to teach a fractur class there. Sometimes they'll do they have a week of adult workshops in historic crafts that I do, their summer institute. I don't know that they do them currently, but since COVID, but I was doing those on a routine basis and had a blast. That was a lot of fun.
Now, you are as Dutch as one can be, as a Landis. You're living in Lancaster County, but you don't speak the dialect.
I married into it, so I wasn't born at Landis, although my parents were also German. My maiden name is Moberg, which is Swiss German. They came from, my mom from Philadelphia, my dad from Pittsburgh, and then settled here before I was born. My husband's family has been here since the first Landises were kicked out of Europe back in the 1600s. So, but they don't speak the German either, unfortunately. It's a funny story that I had run across a lady from our church, and she had a father who spoke High German and thought it would be wonderful to give him a house blessing done with Pennsylvania German. So I did that for her. Using books, I could I borrowed a blessing and put a fractur together for her. And then next time I saw her, she loved it. She came and said, well, my father can't read it. Because I guess his German was not the Pennsylvania German. So even that I worry about
what do you think
losing.
How many artists are there in Pennsylvania
doing fractur?
Doing fractur.
I don't think there's too many, and I always encourage people to continue it. Some of my students from Landis Valley were taking the class specifically so that they could get into fractur, and I know there's a handful. I mean, there's probably 20, I would guess, but not many. And I always tell my students, please, everybody has their own unique style, and this is something that Jerry taught me too when I was learning fractur from him. He encouraged everybody. He said, do not ever think that the market on fractur should be narrower. He says it needs to blow up. He says everybody brings their unique touch to it. You can't be in competition with another person doing fractur. You just can't. And you want the art to continue.
Mm-hmm. But you don't go to markets. You're not at the folk festival.
I have in the past, but not as a routine. No, unfortunately. Generally I've been working other places. I would love to just do fractur and nothing else, but I have a day job and animals, and a week at Kutztown would be heaven, but I can't get away that long. I will do a couple weekend things once in a while, but since COVID I haven't. I really need to get back and pick out a couple.
Can you tell me a little bit about the symbolism of the fractur? I see the birds.
They do have a lot of very typical things. Let me grab a more typical one here.
Flowers and the angels, of course.
Right. Yeah, angels are big, but again, I don't know that fractur's one of those artworks that it breaks its own rules all the time. Some fracturs won't have a border. Some fracturs won't have calligraphy. It's just, there's no one rule to making a fractur, and I think that's very true for the symbols too. Where in hex signs it seems as though certain symbols meant certain things, and from artist to artist to artist that stayed the same. Am I correct? I don't think in a fractur necessarily that's true. It maybe a tulip held a meaning to the artist in that one fractur, but it wasn't, you couldn't read a fraktur through the symbols. There was no universal meaning for everything, at least to my knowledge. The thing that the 1776 celebration kind of really took over were the distal finks and the hearts. They were everywhere, and I think that was the worst of the trendiness that fraktur underwent. And the tulips, oh my gosh, they did these terrible, terrible tulips. So yes, my frakturs all have, because I think a lot of my customers they think that's what a fraktur is. So I try to make my flowers unique. I try not to overwhelm it with hearts and distal finks, but I guess that's, if you look at the 1700 frakturs, they really don't dwell that much on hearts and distal finks. They might have a tulip or two. I don't know. But they don't really hold a symbolism from one fraktur to another that you could say this artist is using tulips to mean this, or to. It's just an illumination of the certificate.
Okay, so what else can we say about fraktur? What would be your wish for the future?
I know fraktur is a folk art, and I think the thing that makes it a folk art is that it's made by common people rather than high artists. However, I think it does have a very unique, I wish it would be accepted as more than just a folk art as well. It's interesting, we've traveled down to, say, Mexico, or on a trip that we took up to Alaska. It's amazing to me that in the art you see that's Mexican, or the art that you see that's Inuit up in Alaska, they use very similar, they'll use tulips, they use stars, they use hearts, it's incredible to me how that imagery plays over and over and over. So perhaps that lends itself to the folk art of it all too. But there's something higher about it than just, I think, the barest of folk arts that I think would be really neat to have people recognize. I don't know.